Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're here to make another video to help you improve your chess. If you haven't told your friends about my YouTube channel, I appreciate if you would do that. That's the best thing you can do. You can also like the videos. You can subscribe to the channel. All right, today we're going to talk about similar but not the same. We're going to talk about positions where things look similar, but if you do the things that you do that work in one position, it doesn't work in another position. The reason I came up with this idea for the video is there's an awful lot of errors I see when I teach people where they learn something and then they get into a game and they see something they think is either the same or they think is similar enough, and they just do it without really checking it. And it turns out it not only doesn't work, sometimes it's disastrous. So I thought I'd come up with a whole bunch of ideas maybe in the opening and the end game when you get into those pattern recognition things where it looks very similar but it's not the same and it doesn't work. And as I said, a lot of my students do this. They say, oh, you told me to do this, and I'm like, not in that position. They said, well, wasn't it something like this? And I go, well, not close enough, no. So they try to do things just on memory. And unless your board vision and your memory is really, really good and you can compare it and analyze it and see that the same thing works, it's a very dangerous thing to do, to just do the same thing. So let's show some examples. I thought I'd start with the end game with two kind of rook-pawn positions. Here, white can go after the pawn on the A file. And if he does go right away, let's see what happens. So king to E6, king takes G6, king to D6, king to F6, king C6, king E6, king B6, king D6, king takes A6, king C7. This is a famous draw. If white comes out, black goes in the corner. And if white tries to stay in the corner, black keeps blocking him. If white ever comes out, black goes in. And if white pushes the pawn, black just blocks in the king. King moves, king moves. We could move back and forth 3 times and get threefold repetition. Or white could push the pawn and stalemate himself. So in this kind of position, leaving the pawn right away is a mistake. What you want to do is drive the king away from the pawn like this to gain a tempo. Now pushing the pawn doesn't do anything. In fact, pushing the pawn is a mistake here. And black can play here, and you can't play king g6 because it's a stalemate, and if you go away, it's still the same draw. But if you leave now, when the king is not touching the pawn, king here, king here, king here, king takes, king c6. White is up a tempo from the previous line. King takes a6, king here, and white wins. So in this position, the right thing to do is to wait and drive the king away from the pawn. And once he's away, now you have that extra tempo to win. So running after the pawn right away here is a big mistake. Now let's compare this to another position that we talked about in the video on rook pawns. Suppose instead you're in a position like this. We don't want a black king there. We want a white pawn there. Suppose you're in a position like this. Okay, well, if you use the same idea as before and say, we don't want to run right away, we want to drive the king away, then that would be the right thing. Sorry, if we run the king right away and don't drive the king away, then we say in the other position that didn't work. But here, that's the only thing that works. King over, king back, king e3, here, takes, here, king here, king takes, king takes, king d5, king here, king here, and he's blocked out, and the pawn will queen. So in the previous position, running after the rook pawn right away didn't work. You had to push him away. But the difference is here, the king is already the maximum distance away. So if you do anything else, if you use the same idea as before with pawn here, king back, king here, and now you run over, the king is actually closer when you do that than he was at the start. And by the time you try to get the pawn, the black king is going to get up into the corner and draw. So these two look very similar. In the previous position, running was not right. It was a draw, and driving him away first got the win. In this position, running is the only way to win, and waiting to drive him away actually is slower because once you push the pawn closer to the king, it doesn't work. It looks similar, but it's not the same. All right, let's try a different type of position. Famous king and pawn against king endgame. So let's say you have a pawn on the 6th rank, and it's black's turn. He has 3 legal moves. What should black do? Well, if it's on any other rank, the black king can go anywhere, and it's a draw. But once the pawn gets to the 6th rank, then the rule is if it's black's turn, he has to go straight back. And when he goes straight back, then if you try to come up, he puts the king there. You could call that the opposition if you want. I don't think it's really the opposition. I just think it has the right tempo. But calling it the opposition is okay. I just think the opposition is really cases where the king's in front of the pawn. But that's just semantics. In any case, black has what he wants. He has the right tempos. If white ever pushes, king here, and white has his choice of draw by lack of mating material or stalemate. Okay, so I was teaching this to Howard Stern many years ago, and Howard got into a position where the king was in front of the pawn, and here it was white's move, and white played here, and now black should keep the opposition by playing king to e7, and white can't make progress, because eventually white has to push the pawn, and then white can't get in front of the pawn, and now black would go straight back. Unfortunately, Howard remembered the other position where the pawn was on the 6th rank instead of being behind the king, where the pawn was in front of the white king, and Howard said, oh, I have to go straight back. So he went straight back here, and his opponent went up here, he went out of the way, king here, pawn here, and Howard lost. And Howard said to me, what did I do wrong? I did what you told me to go. When the king is here, you want me to go straight back. And I said, no, that's when the pawn's in front of the white king, not when the pawn is behind the white king. Here it's the opposition. You need to keep the opposition. Well, at that point, Howard was still a fairly low-rated player, and his board vision wasn't very good. And, that was a common mistake for him to make. When another year or two later, when he got to be a much better player, he would have recognized the positions better. He'd have better board vision. And he wouldn't have made that mistake. His better knowledge, his better understanding of the position led him to understand what was going on here. But there he was trying to do it by rote memorization, and that didn't work. And one of my points is that as you play more and your board vision gets better and you recognize things, you can kind of recognize also what works and what doesn't, and what's similar and what's not. So when you improve your board vision, these kind of errors where you think it's similar and it's not would diminish. Okay, let's look at the every Russian schoolboy knows position, because this just came up the other day, and this is what gave me the idea for the video. All right, so let's say we play the main line of the King's Indian. G6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, bishop e2, castle, knight f3, e5. You can see my video on the King's Indian. This is the main tabia. Okay, so we reached the tabia position. These days, the most popular move for white is knight to e1. But let's say white plays the knight to d2 variation, and black plays knight e8, which I think is the main move. And let's say white plays f3, and black plays f5, and now white plays e takes f5. Okay, so we have here on the ICC, we have a video series by one of the grandmasters called Every Russian Schoolboy Knows, but that used to apply mostly to this position. Now it applies to every basic thing that somebody should know. But it used to be this position. Black can take with the bishop to develop his bishop. He could take with the knight to go for this wonderful outpost. He can take with the rook to control the semi-open file, or he can take with the pawn, which seems to open up the black king. Which way should he take? Well, what he should take with is the pawn. If you don't believe me, let's ask Stockfish. Stockfish, what are the top 2 moves here? Let's turn on the analysis. So you can see there's a massive difference between the best move and the second best move. The best move, G takes f5, the evaluation is black is better by about half a pawn. The second best move, knight takes f5, the evaluation is white is better by about a half a pawn. So there's almost a pawn difference in the evaluation here. Right now there's 1.01. It jumps around as it looks deeper. But the right way to take, as every Russian schoolboy knows, is to take with the g-pawn and have your pawns controlling all these center squares. And a lot of times, lower rated players say you can't do that, it opens up your king. But there's a wall of pawns here, and there's a million black pieces behind that wall, and there's no white pieces over there. So the black king is super safe. If white checkmates black here in another 20 moves, it's because black must have played terribly, not because his king is exposed. So a lot of people think, oh, you can't push the pawns in front of your king. That goes against principle. Well, there is no principle that says you can't push pawns in front of your king. The principle is that you shouldn't unnecessarily loosen your king up if you don't have to. And here, black is not unnecessarily loosening his king up. His king is perfectly safe. And as Stockfish says, black is the one who's much better here. So if the every Russian schoolboy knows is that in this kind of position you take with a pawn. As a quick funny story, when I first won the Philadelphia Championship almost half a century ago, I hate to say it, I was teaching an adult evening school class, and most of the people were higher rated than I was. Not higher rated. I said that wrong. Most of the people were older than I was, but they were all beginners. So here I am, I'm teaching a class, I'm the Philadelphia champion, but I'm 23 years old, and they're, all in their 30s and 40s. And we get to this position for some reason, and I said, you take with the pawn, and one of the guys in the group said, you can't do that, that's no good. And I said, why is that? He said, well, that opens up the king, you're going to get checkmated. And I said, well, that's the way that all the grandmasters play it, if you believe that. Go to tournaments and play it the other way, and see what you get, and see if you can prove, play this line for white. And if you could beat the grandmasters playing this line, maybe they'll change their mind. Of course, we didn't have engines to certify things like we have here, where the engine's already saying, yeah, that's the better move. I said, but if you could beat the good players doing, in this position with white, then, you can prove them wrong. By the way, the problem with taking with a piece like, let's say, the bishop is white's going to play knight on 2 to e4, and this knight is really good. The pawn on the f-file is gone. It can't drive it away, and the d-pawn can't drive it away. And all of a sudden, this bishop is blocked and becomes a really weak piece. If you take with the pawn, this pawn is mobile, and the bishop on g7 is much better. Once you take with a piece and he blockades that square, then it doesn't work as much anymore. And you can see here, if I scroll up again, Stockfish is saying if you do this, white is ahead by 1.33. Well, usually it only takes about one pawn to be close to winning the game. So Stockfish already thinks that white might be winning this game when he gets to this position with his big positional advantage. All right, so why am I showing that? Well, a student the other day played a game, and I don't remember his exact game, so we'll just make up some moves here. It was something like e4, e6, knight f3, knight c6. I'm just going to play kind of a foreign knightsy kind of thing. Bishop, knight, 2 knights defense, pawn here, castle, bishop e7, bishop g5, castle. And at some point, it wasn't this exact position, but at some point, white played bishop takes f6. And here, my student said, all right, Dan, I remember what you said about every Russian schoolboy knows you should take with the pawn and not the bishop, which I used to do, so I took with the pawn. And I'm like, oh my, that's a terrible move. I said, you should take, in fact, when I was going through the game and he showed me bishop takes knight, I said, all right, well, you played bishop takes bishop. And he said, no, your voice was in my head. And I said, every Russian schoolboy knows you take with the pawn. Well, let's let Stockfish look at those two moves. Stockfish, top 2 moves here. You got to recapture. Now it's just the opposite. Now bishop takes f6 gives black the advantage with the bishop pair of about, right now, about 1/3 to 1/2 of a pawn. And if you take with the pawn, then all of a sudden white has the advantage by about 1/2 a pawn. So this is exactly the opposite of the last situation we looked at. The last situation we looked at, when you take with the pawn, it's the best way by far, and black has the advantage, and it's about a pawn worse to take with anything else. Here, it's about a pawn worse to take with the pawn, because you just open up your king, you weaken the f5 square, you double your pawns, you block in your bishop. You know, this is not very similar at all to the every Russian schoolboy knows position in the King's Indian. So I went back with my student and I showed him the King's Indian and I showed him his game. And I said, look, the differences are enormous. It's not anything like the same. I said, you're just opening up your king. You're doubling your pawns. You're blocking your pieces. I said, there's no reason to take with the pawn. But he was trying to remember it and he just remembered every Russian schoolboy knows. I said, well, the every Russian schoolboy knows has to do with a specific kind of lines in the King's Indian. It doesn't have to do with every time you could take with a G pawn onto the F file. That's not the general way to do it. All right, let's look at some openings where we have similar things. One of the stories I told in one of the other videos is worth retelling here, and that is Grandmaster was teaching a beginner, and the beginner says, teach me something about openings. Let me make the board bigger again. And let me straighten it up here. All right, so the Grandmaster says, all right, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, and if he does that, the main line is bishop a4. So the beginner goes, okay. So the beginner goes to a tournament, and he comes back and he says to the Grandmaster, that Roy Lopez you gave me as a terrible opening. And the Grandmaster says, no, it's not. It's perfectly good. And he says, well, I played it and I immediately lost a piece. And the Grandmaster said, show me. So the beginner says, e4, c5. And the Grandmaster goes, wait. He goes, that's not you can't play a Roy Lopez. That's a Sicilian. And the beginner says, well, I did play the Roy Lopez. I did what you told me. I played knight f3 and bishop b5. And the Grandmaster says, all right, let's take a look. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. Beginner says, Roy Lopez. Grandmaster says, no, the Roy Lopez is with the pawn on e5, not the pawn on c5. This is the Rossolimo variation of the Sicilian. And the beginner says, okay, whatever. So anyway, he played a6, and I did what you told me, and I played bishop a4. And the Grandmaster laughed, and he says, that's not what I told you. I told you to do that when the pawn is on e5, not c5. And the beginner says, but that you told me to bring out the pawn here, the knight here, and when he hits my pawn, you move the bishop back. And the Grandmaster said, but not in this position. It's the position with the pawn on e5. And the Grandmaster says, let me guess what happened. He played b5, you played bishop b3, and he played c4, and he trapped your bishop, and he won the game. And the beginner goes, yep, that's right. So the Roy Lopez is no good. And the Grandmaster says, but this isn't the Roy Lopez. When someone plays e4, c5, this is a Sicilian. You could do the first couple moves you did, but it's not the Roy Lopez. But when he plays a6, you have to take the knight in this variation because of what you said. Bishop a4 is no good. But if he had played the Roy Lopez, e4, e5, it takes two to tango. In order to play the Roy Lopez, both sides have to be playing these 5 half moves here. You can't have any differences in that or it's not a Roy Lopez. Now if he plays a6, bishop a4 is a good move because if he plays b5 and you play bishop b3, there's no c-pawn here to trap your bishop. So this is the Roy Lopez. The line you played, bishop a4, is just a blunder in the Rossolimo variation of the Sicilian. But the beginner didn't see any difference. He just saw that the white pieces were making the same moves. The black pieces looked similar. So it was similar but not the same. All right, let's look at a couple more openings where similar is not the same. If you play e4, black plays e5, and you play f4, that's the King's Gambit. And the best way to play against the King's Gambit is to take the pawn. Let's ask Stockfish and say, Stockfish, if you don't have any book in you, what are you going to play here? Stockfish says, oh boy, black's better already. I'm going to take that pawn, and black's ahead by about minus 0.4 here already by taking the pawn. Okay, but suppose before white plays f4, he plays knight c3 first, and black plays knight f6. And now white plays f4. That looks like a King's Gambit. This is called the Vienna Gambit. Well, I assume you should still take the pawn, right? Well, wrong. No, here, taking the pawn is a giant mistake. Pawn takes pawn, e5, and now the knight has nowhere to go. He can't go there, he can't go there, he can't go there, he can't go there. Stockfish says the best move is to just bring the knight back. You could pin it with the queen first, but then he'll play queen e2 also, and then you still have to bring the knight back. And now white plays something like knight f3 to stop the queen check. And black has lost 2 tempos in the opening and lost some space. And you can see white is up by about 8/10 of a pawn right now. So where e4, e5, f4, the best move by far is to take, in the Vienna Gambit, where white plays knight c3, knight f6 first, and then f4, now taking is a big mistake. And instead, you should play d5 and counterattack the center. And as you can see, black actually has a slight advantage here on Stockfish. So, again, it's similar, but it's not the same. If you use the ideas from the from the King's Gambit, when you're playing the Vienna game and say, oh, you should take the pawn, well, makes all the difference in the world when those knights come out like that first, because now he can AWL you. If you don't know what AWL is, attack with something worth less. I have a video on that too on my channel, and now the knight goes back to g8. All right, let's do a couple more things in the opening that are similar but not the same. Let's, we'll talk about the difference between the dragon and the accelerated dragon. In the dragon, e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes, knight f6, knight c3, g6, bishop e3, bishop g7. The main move here for white is to play f3 to stop the knight from going to g4 and later have him push the kingside pawns. And that's a really good move. And, you know, we could ask the engine, Mr. Engine, what do you think about f3? The engine says, ooh, good opening for white. He's up. Right now, he's up about, thinks the dragon is not a great opening for black. He's got white up by almost a pawn, right now about 8/10 of a pawn. So you can see the Yugoslav attack in the dragon is a really good opening for white, because normally a white advantage is about, 1 or 2/10 of a pawn. And of course, that's why you don't see grandmasters playing too many dragons anymore. Okay, on the other hand, let's say black plays an accelerated dragon instead of a dragon. e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6 instead of d6. d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, g6. Now the main line here is to play the Maroczy bind, but let's say white plays the knight c3 line, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, and now let's say white plays f3. He says, oh, I know this is a dragon. You play f3 against the dragon, and white plays f3. All right, Mr. Stockfish, go to work. Tell me, what should black do against f3? Stockfish says, oh, look at that. Black already has equalized against that not very accurate move. Well, he's back down to about 0.02. He says black should castle, and then black's going to be playing d5. For instance, if black castles and white plays queen d2, already black can play d5 in one move. And white's advantage is pretty much gone. Right now, Stockfish has black up by about 1/10 of a pawn. So playing against the accelerated dragon like you're playing the dragon, it doesn't work. f3 is not a good move here. If we look at the top 3 moves in this position for white, you can see that f3 doesn't make the list. If white wants to retain his opening advantage against the accelerated dragon, and white gets to this position without playing the Maroczy bind, then Stockfish is suggesting the only 2 moves that give white a nice advantage are knight takes c6 followed by e5, or playing bishop c4. So bishop c4 gives white an advantage. Knight takes, pawn takes, e5, where the knight can't come toward the middle that easily. Stockfish suggests just knight g8 is the best move. All right, so again, we have similar but not the same. So in the dragon, where black plays d6 and not knight c6, in this position, g6, bishop e3, bishop g7, f3 is a very good move. If black is instead playing the accelerated dragon, where he doesn't have a pawn on d6, but instead he has a knight on c6, then f3 is not one of the better moves, and black can equalize immediately. So again, similar but not the same. One last one. Let's look at a Grunfeld. Grunfeld, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, Grunfeld. And now if white takes, black takes, white plays e4. That's the main line of the exchange Grunfeld. Knight c3, pawn takes. And now black can start hitting at the center with like bishop g7. And if white plays, let's say he plays bishop c4, then c5 hits this pawn again. White would guard it. Black can keep attacking it. White can keep guarding it. And black's got a good, decent counterattack here. Okay, so main line of the exchange Grunfeld. All right, but what if black tries to like transpose that earlier by playing, instead of playing g6 here first, what if he plays d5? The idea being if knight c3, g6, you're in a Grunfeld. Well, that looks very similar. It looks like a very reasonable move, you know, to play d5 there. And you could also get into that position from d4, d5, Queen's Gambit. What could be better than developing a piece and guarding a pawn? Well, it turns out that's similar, but it's not very good. Knight f6. Look at the advantage that white has. Mr. Stockfish will bring you back in again. Look at that. Already up to about a 1.0 almost advantage. White's almost winning the game already. This is one of the most, if you want to see more on this, you can go to my video on the most common opening inaccuracies, and this is one of the most common. The problem is that white gets an AWL. He takes the pawn, and if black takes with the queen, he develops with tempo and then gets a chance to get a strong center. And if black takes with the knight, here beginners play e4, which is a good move, but when you see a good move, look for a better one. What I was taught is you play knight f3 first, and then you play e4. The idea of knight f3 is to prevent e5. And again, let's bring in Stockfish to convince you. Stockfish, let's look at the top two moves here for white. Okay, so if we let Stockfish go to like 25 ply, you can see there's quite a bit of difference here. Knight f3 gives white an advantage of about 1.3 pawns here, now 1.2. And e4 gives white an advantage of about just dropped to 0.47, but I think it'll go back up again. But look at the difference. Right now, the difference is, they just dropped almost to even. But the difference has been staying around 3/4 of a pawn. So knight f3 is a considerably more accurate move here. The idea is you play knight f3, and then against almost all of his moves, you play e4 on the next move with a really big advantage. So this is nothing like a Grunfeld. In a Grunfeld, when you play e4, you can play knight takes c3 and start hitting the center. Here, when you play knight f3, if he plays knight f6, knight c6, e4, knight f6, knight c3, white just has a big center. Look at that. White's advantage in this position has now grown to 2.8 pawns. Oh, sorry, 2.1 pawns. Now it's at 2.2. So already, Stockfish is saying, let me play this for white 100 times and I should be able to win almost all 100 games. Advantage of more than 2 pawns in the opening is massive. And notice black hasn't lost any material. The material's still equal. But white's domination of the center and his ability to push those pawns and attack the knights are pretty good. I remember one game I saw where black here played bishop g4, white played d5, black played knight here, and now white played bishop e2, and after the game I said to him, I bet you can play knight takes e5. I'll have to check it with the computer. He says, knight takes e5, that loses the queen. I said, yeah, but then you've got bishop checks, pawn here, pawn takes pawn, and now you're threatening pawn here and pawn here, and black has almost no defense here. He's temporarily up a queen, but white's threatening to win the queen, and there's pretty much nothing black can do. And if you look at the engine now, Stockfish has white up by 4 pawns in this line. So it's kind of a cute queen sack in that line. All right, you could call that a trap. Okay, so today we've looked at similar but not the same. You got to be very careful when you learn things. When you learn things, you have to know how similar is it to apply. For instance, suppose you're studying basic tactics. Suppose you buy John Bain's Chess Tactics for Students, and you study the puzzles over and over and over again, and they're the kind of puzzles that appear in games. That's why I recommend that book. But when they do appear in a game, it's not going to be the exact same position that it was in the Bain book. It's going to be something very similar. The question is it similar enough? Well, your pattern recognition will tell you, yes, it's very similar. Yes, I'm going to be able to try to play it, but then your analysis has to back it up. You can't just play it because it's similar. You have to analyze it and say, does what the things that worked in the Bane book work in this position? If the answer is yes, okay. If you were careful, then go play it. If the answer is no, then you probably have to play something else. All right, thanks for watching. Again, tell people about the video. Hope people enjoy the channel, and we'll see you next time. Bye.